The epic story of the English language in North America is fascinating. Let's learn more from the History of English podcast.
The history of the English language. We're going to explore the expansion of English into North America in the 1600s. During this period, England was laying the groundwork for the British Empire that was soon to come, and English speakers were no longer just traveling to distant places around the world. They were starting to make permanent homes there, and they carried their language with them. But they not only took the English language, they also took their specific local dialects. We'll also explore how regional dialects in England shaped the various forms of English that were being planted around the world. We're going to explore the expansion of English into North America in the early 1600s. This represents the early stages of what became known as the British Empire. My focus is going to be on the language and how the spread of the British Empire shaped the way the English language is spoken today. As the year 1606 came to an end, the preparations for a settlement in Virginia were underway. With a royal charter in hand, the London Company investors were preparing the ships for the expedition and gathering the men who would serve as the first settlers. They were all men at this point. Women would come a few years later. By March of the following year, they were ready to go. 3 ships left England to take the settlers to Virginia. The plan was to find a suitable site in the Chesapeake Bay region. A couple of decades earlier, the area had been surveyed by men from the Roanoke settlement on the Outer Banks, south of the Chesapeake. The Roanoke settlement didn't have a natural harbor, and the shifting shoals along the coast of the Outer Banks were dangerous hazards. Of course, the Roanoke settlement failed, so for this second effort to colonize the region, it was thought that the Chesapeake Bay region would be more suitable. The ships carrying 120 settlers arrived at the bay in April of 1607. The English explored the lower part of a river which emptied into the bay, and they soon identified a location where they could erect some tents. The local people called the river Powhatan, but the English renamed it the James River in honor of King James. And they decided to name their new settlement after him as well. They called it Jamestown. It was little more than a cleared piece of land where they could erect some tents, but Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. And for the first time, the English language had a permanent footing on a new continent. As a quick aside, I should note that the English were not the first Europeans to establish a settlement in North America. The Spanish had built forts along the Gulf Coast and in Florida, and 3 years earlier, the French had erected a small trading post along the eastern coast of what is today Nova Scotia in Canada. It was founded by the French explorer Samuel de Champlain. The settlement was called Port Royal, and the region around it became known as Acadia. Now, I mentioned this slightly earlier French settlement because control of the region passed between the French, the Scots, and the English over the following century. Again, the region was called Acadia, and the people who lived there were mostly French-speaking and were called Acadians. Well, in the 1700s, when the British finally secured permanent control over the region, they kicked out many of the French-speaking Acadians. Since they needed to find somewhere else to live, many of them decided to relocate to the French territory of Louisiana. So they traveled down the eastern seaboard of North America, around Florida, and along the Gulf Coast until they reached the French territory there. And that's where they settled. Again, they were called Acadians, but over time, the word Acadian was slurred and reduced down to Cajun. And that's how the Cajun culture of South Louisiana originated. It's directly tied back to this original French settlement at Acadia in eastern Canada. And again, it has its roots here in the first decade of the 1600s. Now again, the English arrived in Jamestown a few years after the French had settled in Nova Scotia. These first English settlers were adventurers looking to make a quick fortune. They didn't really have any experience working the land, and most didn't have any carpentry skills. They also weren't familiar with the local crops and vegetation, and on top of that, they missed the planting season. So they soon started to run out of food. They also had a problem finding fresh water since most of the water in the region was brackish and not drinkable. Add in the diseases carried by mosquitoes, and everything soon turned into a disaster. Of the original 120 settlers, more than 2/3 of them died within the first 9 months. Over the next few years, the Virginia Company sent over 1,000 more settlers to the colony, and more than half of them died as well. The settlers also encountered the local indigenous people, who called the Englishmen Otosantosuwak. The name literally meant the people who wear leg coverings. The native people in the region were divided into many different tribes, some at war with each other, so that also became a challenge. If the settlers befriended one tribe, they risked becoming the enemies of a rival tribe. And some of the native people were not happy at the prospect of a permanent European settlement in the region. Over the following weeks and months, several settlers were attacked and killed by members of various tribes in the region. By the end of that first summer in 1607, Jamestown was rapidly running out of men as someone died almost every day. The men who had been put in charge of the settlement started to turn to one of their fellow settlers named John Smith for help. He seemed to possess the leadership skills that the others lacked, and under his guidance, several simple buildings were constructed, including a storehouse and several huts. He also made excursions to trade with the local indigenous tribes. They were able to provide some food supplies, and through these efforts, Smith quickly emerged as the de facto leader of Jamestown during this early period. Smith traveled extensively throughout the region, surveying the land and meeting with the native people who lived in the area. Of course, there were no highways, so both the settlers and the indigenous people used the rivers and waterways for transportation. The English were also eager to determine if any of the rivers provided a convenient way to reach the Pacific Ocean on the other side of the continent. Of course, at the time, they didn't really know how wide the continent was, and they didn't know that there was no such water route. During this period, Smith kept notes, and he eventually prepared an account of his first year at Jamestown. The account is commonly referred to as A True Relation of Virginia, and it was published the following year in 1608. The work is important to language historians because it contains the first recorded use of many words associated with North America during this period. For example, he referred to an animal in the region which the native people called a rahaghum, R-A-H-A-U-G-H-C-U-M. That was his attempt to spell the word the way the local people pronounced it. The pronunciation and spelling quickly evolved within English, and it soon became known as a raccoon, and Smith was the first person to record the name of the animal in English. He also gave us some of the earliest uses of words like cornfield and knapsack. Since Smith explored the waterways along the Chesapeake, he also included words related to those features as well. He's the first known English writer to use the word fall as a noun in its plural form to describe the falling water found along some waterways. The result was the word falls, as in waterfalls or Niagara Falls. And speaking of waterways, Smith's account included a reference to creeks. He wrote, quote, "The bay where he dwelleth hath in it 3 cricks," end quote. And it's worth noting that he referred to them as cricks, C-R-I-C-K-S, not creeks. Creek actually became a common pronunciation of creek in many parts of colonial America, and it still survives in some rural dialects, though creek has largely replaced that older pronunciation. The interesting thing is that John Smith was using crick from the outset in the early 1600s. By the way, the word creek was in common use at the time, but it usually referred to an inlet or a harbor along a coastline. It was people like John Smith who applied the term to small streams while exploring the coastal regions of North America. Notice that the quote where he used the word crick referred to several cricks in a bay. Well, how could a crick or creek be in a bay? Well, again, at the time, the word referred to a coastal inlet. So as settlers like Smith explored large bodies of water like the Chesapeake Bay, they would come across these inlets, which were really the mouths of rivers that emptied into the bay. So the word creek was applied to those inlets in much the same way that the word was normally applied to a coastal inlet or harbor. And then, as they traveled up those waterways, the word was extended to the waterways themselves. And then gradually it became restricted to the small streams that fed those larger rivers and waterways. So that sense of the word creek evolved within early American English and was related to the early exploration of the region.